Few characters in the history of literature and film have proven as deathless as Count Dracula. Here's a question. What's the first thing you think of when you hear Dracula? Is it a terrifying monster in a cape saying, "I want to suck your blood"? Or maybe it's a romantic anti-hero looking for revenge? Or even a dad running a hotel for monsters? Dracula has had more lives than a cat, each one weirder than the last. In this video, we will explore the many faces of Dracula, the most famous vampire of all time. That's if you don't count Batman. Dracula is not just a vampire, he is the vampire. Dracula is the one who redefined what it means to be a creature of the night. Long before Dracula, European folklore was filled with tales of vampires. These were often grotesque, bloated corpses that rose from their graves to feed on the living. Names like the Strigoi from Romania and Nosferatu from Eastern Europe described undead beings that were feared for their nocturnal habits. But the vampire we know and love today, his story begins in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel titled Dracula. Many believe he drew inspiration from Vlad the Impaler, a 15th century Wallachian ruler. He earned his gruesome reputation through his favorite method of execution, impaling his enemies on wooden stakes. This was a slow, agonizing death meant to instill fear. Since the novel, Dracula has been reimagined in every possible way. Before Dracula became the suave, cape-wearing vampire we know today, there was Nosferatu. Released in 1922, this German silent film was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Since the filmmakers didn't have the rights to the book, they changed the names of characters. Count Dracula became Count Orlok. They also tweaked the story just enough to try avoiding legal trouble. Spoiler, it didn't work. Stoker's estate sued and a court ordered all copies of the film destroyed in 1925, just 3 years after its release. Thankfully, a few survived, preserving this iconic piece of horror history. Count Orlok in Nosferatu wasn't the romantic predator we often associate with Dracula. Instead, he was horrifyingly grotesque, bowed, rat-like, with long claws and fangs that seemed more animal than man. Nosferatu redefined what vampires could be. It showed they could be less seductive and more nightmarish. The film also introduced key elements of vampire lore, like the idea that sunlight could kill them, which wasn't in Stoker's original novel. This eerie, shadow-filled masterpiece set the stage for every Dracula adaptation to follow. Fast forward to 1931 and Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula in Universal Pictures' Dracula forever changed how we see vampires. This was the first authorized adaptation of Stoker's novel, and it made Dracula a Hollywood legend. Lugosi's Dracula wasn't a hideous monster like Orlok. He was a charming, mysterious aristocrat with piercing eyes, a thick Hungarian accent, and an unforgettable cape. The film was the first time the character was depicted wearing a cape, and it became an iconic part of Dracula's visual identity. While Bram Stoker's novel described Dracula as having a long black cloak, it wasn't until Lugosi's performance that the flowing, high-collared cape became synonymous with the vampire. The choice of the cape was partly practical. It added to Dracula's aristocratic mystique and helped with dramatic entrances and exits, especially on stage. Lugosi had played Dracula in a 1924 Broadway production before the film. It also worked well with the film's lightning and shadows, enhancing his eerie, hypnotic presence. Lugosi's performance of Dracula was magnetic. He brought a blend of menace and sophistication that made Dracula not just terrifying, but strangely alluring. His slow, deliberate speech and hypnotic stare turned Dracula into a cultural icon, giving us the template for every suave vampire to come. Together, Nosferatu and Bela Lugosi's Dracula represent two sides of the vampire coin, one grotesque and monstrous, the other elegant and seductive. These early adaptations shaped Dracula's legacy, proving that whether he's horrifying or charming, the Lord of the Night is here to stay. In the late 1950s, Hammer horror revived the character. They made him scarier, sexier, and bloodier than ever. Christopher Lee first donned the cape in 1958. He would return for multiple sequels throughout the 1960s and 70s. Lee's Dracula was a stark departure from Bela Lugosi's charming and hypnotic Count. Instead, he brought an animalistic ferocity and raw intensity to the role. Lee's Dracula rarely spoke, letting his piercing gaze and towering presence do most of the work. When he did speak, his deep, commanding voice made every word feel like a threat. But what really set Lee apart was his physicality. He played Dracula as a predator, often lunging at victims with bloodshot eyes and bared fangs, making the character feel dangerous and unpredictable. While the early Hammer films were groundbreaking, the later sequels embraced camp. The rise of counterculture and shifting taste in horror meant audiences were no longer satisfied with the straightforward scares of earlier decades. Instead, they craved something more self-aware and playful, and Dracula was an easy target for reinvention. This era saw Dracula being used in ways that embraced absurdity. TV shows like The Monsters featured Grandpa Monster, a comical vampire clearly inspired by Dracula, complete with a cape and exaggerated Transylvanian accent. In 1979, Love at First Bite took the parody even further. Starring George Hamilton, Count Dracula is evicted from his Transylvanian castle by the government and decides to relocate to New York City. There, he falls head over fangs for Cindy Sondheim, a high-strung fashion model, and becomes determined to win her love. However, things aren't easy for Dracula in the modern world. He has to navigate culture shock, dodge Cindy's jealous ex-boyfriend, Dr. Jeffrey Rosenberg, a descendant of Van Helsing, and figure out how to sustain his vampire lifestyle in a city that never sleeps. Packed with absurd comedy, romantic chaos, and Dracula's struggles to adapt to 1970s nightlife, the film flips the classic vampire story into a light-hearted parody full of laughs. Dracula's shifts into camp and parody during the 60s and 70s proved that he wasn't just a creature of the night, he was a creature of reinvention. Dracula's dark and brooding legacy took a hilarious turn in the world of comedy, with two standard adaptations showing just how funny the vampire lord could be: Dracula Dead and Loving It from 1995 and the Hotel Transylvania franchise. Directed by Mel Brooks, Dracula Dead and Loving It is a parody of classic vampire films, particularly Bram Stoker's Dracula and its earlier screen adaptations. In this version, Dracula is less a terrifying predator and more of an oblivious, bumbling aristocrat who can't quite get anything right. This film is packed with over-the-top gags, from Dracula's disastrous attempts to hypnotize people to absurdly gory scenes that turn horror tropes into comedic gold. It mocks the melodrama of earlier Dracula films while still paying homage to them. Fast forward to 2010s and Dracula takes an entirely new persona in Hotel Transylvania. Voiced by Adam Sandler, this Dracula is a lovable, overprotective dad who runs a luxury hotel for monsters. The series flips the script. Instead of being the predator, Dracula is a family man struggling to let his daughter Mavis grow up. Oh, and also trying to keep humans from discovering his monster-friendly business. Dracula is also represented in kids' media, transforming him from a terrifying predator into a lovable, family-friendly icon. First appearing in 1971, Count Chocula became one of the most recognizable faces in kids' advertising. He's a cartoonish, chocolate-loving vampire who proudly declares, "I want to eat your cereal instead of your blood." Alongside Frankie Berry and Boo Berry, Count Chocula was part of a monster-themed cereal lineup. His goofy demeanor and over-the-top accent parodied the classic vampire. Then there's Count Von Count. This Dracula-inspired Muppet shares the Count's love of darkness, a Transylvanian accent, and a dramatic cape. But his obsession isn't blood, it's numbers. Whether he's counting bats, cookies, or days of the week, Count Von Count turned smart into a fun experience. Dracula has evolved significantly in modern TV and film. One of the most iconic modern portrayals came in Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dracula in this film, portrayed by Gary Oldman, is a tortured romantic figure driven by love and vengeance. The film begins with Vlad Dracula, a 15th century knight renouncing God after the death of his beloved wife, Elisabetta. Cursed to become an immortal vampire, Dracula lives for centuries, feeding on blood and plotting revenge. 4 centuries later, Dracula discovers Mina, played by the amazing Winona Ryder. Mina is a young woman who resembles his lost wife. Believing her to be the reincarnation of Elisabetta, he travels to London to seduce her while unleashing chaos. The film reframes the character as a tragic anti-hero cursed by God after renouncing his fate when his beloved one dies. This version of Dracula is both horrifying and mesmerizing, cementing him as more than just a monster. He's an immortal being haunted by love and loss. The BBC's 3-part miniseries Dracula took a bold, modern approach to the character, blending classic horror with dark humor and psychological depth. Claes Bang plays Dracula as a charming yet ruthless predator who revels in his own evil.
It's not your fault, Johnny. You mustn't blame yourself.
Unlike earlier versions, this Dracula is more self-aware, even philosophical, as he grapples with his immortality and the implications of his actions. It's a fresh take on the Dracula legend, blending classic gothic elements with a modern edge that honors the original story. Meanwhile, action-packed interpretations like Dracula Untold reimagine Dracula as a tragic anti-hero in a dark origin story. The film follows Vlad III, a 15th century prince who turns to dark powers to protect his family and kingdom from the Ottoman Empire. Desperate to save his people, Vlad strikes a deal with an ancient vampire, gaining superhuman strength, speed, and the ability to transform into a swarm of bats at the cost of his humanity and an insatiable thirst for blood. The film attempts to humanize Dracula by portraying him as a reluctant monster, torn between his love for his family and the cause he bears. It blends elements of historical fiction with supernatural action, offering an interesting take on the iconic vampire's origins. Dracula isn't just a character, it's an idea, a symbol of fear, power, and immortality that continues to resonate across generations. But why does he endure when so many other fictional icons fade into obscurity? The secret lies in his adaptability. Dracula has been everything: a grotesque monster in Nosferatu, a suave seducer in Bela Lugosi's Dracula, and even a comedic dad in Hotel Transylvania. Each adaptation reshapes him to reflect the fears, desires, and humor of its time. He's a mirror for our collective anxieties, whether about death, forbidden love, or the unknown. Beyond that, Dracula taps into universal themes. He embodies immortality, a concept both alluring and horrifying. As long as we fear the dark, crave mystery, and yearn for immortality, Dracula will remain relevant. He's not just a creature of the night, he's a creature of storytelling, endlessly reborn to haunt us in new and fascinating ways. Which version of Dracula is your favorite? Let me know in the comments.